What does a family worth over $400 billion look like up close? Turns out, they own a modest ranch house on a quiet street in a town of 55,000 people. But while the house might not have any lavish gates or fancy marble columns, the family inside employs 1 in every 10 workers in the entire state, funds its museums, builds its airport, and makes politicians physically nervous when they walk into a room. This is the Walton family, and they own Arkansas, quite literally. But the story of how that happened is wilder than you think. Chapter 1. The Empire Built from a Dime Store. There's a house in Bentonville, Arkansas, that will genuinely stop you if you know what you're looking at. It's not grand. The ones we usually see with high-level security detail or massive gates protecting the wealth inside. It's just a modest mid-century ranch home on a quiet, tree-lined street. The kind of place you'd drive past completely without a second thought. But that house is where the richest family in American history was raised. Where Sam Walton, the man who built Walmart from absolute zero, chose to live even after he'd become a billionaire. Not because he couldn't afford better. Because he genuinely didn't want it. He refused marble floors. He didn't want a swimming pool. He drove a beat-up Ford pickup and ate breakfast at the same diner in faded clothes for decades. The wealth was almost beside the point to him. And that contradiction is at the very heart of everything that follows. Sam Walton died in 1992, worth about $23 billion. Today, his 3 surviving children, Rob, Jim, and Alice, have a combined net worth exceeding over $400 billion. Let that number breathe for a second. That's more than Jeff Bezos, more than Elon Musk, more than the entire GDP of countries like Portugal or New Zealand. Generated by one family, in one generation, from a dime store in a town of 3,000 people. But here's the thing that makes the Waltons genuinely different from every other ultra-wealthy dynasty in America. They have built a system of influence so deeply embedded in Arkansas that the state's economy, politics, and culture essentially revolve around their decisions. Walmart is the largest private employer in the United States, with over 1.6 million workers on its payroll. In Arkansas specifically, roughly 1 in every 10 jobs connects directly or indirectly to Walmart or a Walton family enterprise. Not 1 in 50, not 1 in 20. 1 in 10. The corporate headquarters employs thousands in Bentonville. Distribution centers employ thousands more across the state. And then there's the entire ecosystem that exists solely to support Walmart. Suppliers, logistics companies, service businesses, all of it tracing back to decisions made around one family's table. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back to a boy who grew up during the Great Depression and never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. Chapter 2. Sam Walton, the boy who learned from poverty. Samuel Moore. Walton was born on March 29, 1918, in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, into a family that was barely keeping the lights on. His father, Thomas, tried farming and failed. The family relocated to Missouri, where Thomas scraped together work as a mortgage agent during the depths of the Great Depression. And here's where Sam's entire worldview got forged into something permanent. Because as a young boy, Sam would ride along with his father to deliver foreclosure notices to families who couldn't make their payments. Picture that for a moment. A small kid sitting in a dusty car, watching grown men and women weep as someone told them they were losing the land they'd worked for years. Losing everything, with no safety net waiting to catch them. That experience did something to Sam that no business school class ever could. It taught him that financial security is fragile, that forces completely beyond your control can destroy everything you've built, and that the only real protection is to build something so efficient, so lean, and so deeply entrenched that nothing can take it from you. He was maybe 8 years old when he learned that lesson. He never unlearned it. So Sam started working at age 7, milking the family cow before school, bottling the extra milk, and delivering it by bicycle to neighbors. He had paper routes so long that he eventually hired other kids to help him run them. He sold magazine subscriptions door to door. He raised and sold rabbits and pigeons. By high school, during the Great Depression, Sam Walton was pulling in between $4,000 and $5,000 a year as a teenager. At that tender age, he had realized bone deep that hustle was the only currency that actually mattered. Sam basically excelled at everything he touched. Youngest Eagle Scout in Missouri history, high school quarterback, student body president. He had this magnetic quality. People just naturally wanted to follow him, which turns out to be a skill worth considerably more than any degree. He worked his way through the University of Missouri, running delivery routes and waiting tables, graduated with an economics degree in 1940, and 3 days later walked into a J.C. Penney store and started as a management trainee earning $75 a month. World War II pulled him into Army intelligence, and it was there he met Helen Robson, educated, ambitious, finance degree, and the daughter of a successful banker and rancher. Helen brought connections Sam still lacked, and she turned out to be far more than a supportive wife. She was a genuine strategic partner who suggested profit sharing with employees, a revolutionary idea that Sam implemented and that eventually made thousands of Walmart workers genuinely wealthy. In 1945, Sam borrowed $20,000 from his father-in-law, added $5,000 from Army savings, and bought a Ben Franklin variety store in Newport, Arkansas. He was 27. He obsessed over that store the way most people never obsess over anything, rearranging displays, testing pricing, sourcing from the cheapest possible suppliers, staying late, arriving early. Within 3 years, he'd transformed a store doing $80,000 annually into one generating $225,000. Most successful Ben Franklin in a 6-state region. Then he made a mistake that haunted him and ultimately changed everything. His lease had no renewal clause. When it expired, his landlord refused to renew. He wanted the profitable store for his own son. Sam had spent 5 years building something extraordinary, and a legal technicality allowed someone else to simply take it. He never forgot that lesson. Always control the terms, always protect yourself legally, and never let someone else hold the document that determines your fate. He found a new location, Bentonville, population 3,000. Most retailers would have laughed. Sam saw underserved customers that everyone else had ignored. On May 9, 1950, Walton's Five and Dime opened on the town square. Sam Walton was starting over at 32, in a tiny Arkansas town with a wife and growing family, armed with nothing but hard-won experience and a refusal to be beaten. Chapter 3: The Walmart Revolution and the Low-Wage Model. Through the 1950s, Sam and his brother Bud methodically opened more variety stores. By 1962, they owned 16 locations. But Sam was watching something happening in American retail that most people his age completely missed: the discount store revolution. Kmart and Target were opening massive suburban stores and selling brand names at unbeatable prices, and they were making extraordinary money doing it. Sam believed he could adapt that model specifically for rural America, for the small towns that Kmart and Target had decided weren't worth their time. He was right. On July 2, 1962, the first Walmart Discount City opened in Rogers, Arkansas. The store wasn't pretty: bare concrete floors, exposed pipes, merchandise stacked on folding tables. But the prices were genuinely shocking. Sam was operating on margins so thin that competitors assumed he was either crazy or lying about his numbers. He wasn't crazy. He was playing a completely different game, one built on volume, logistics efficiency, and cost-cutting at every single level of the operation. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Walmart grew explosively. Sam pioneered distribution center networks, early computer inventory systems, and supply chain logistics that let him operate on margins nobody else could come close to matching. In 1970, Walmart went public at $16.50 per share. An investor who bought 100 shares that day would eventually hold stock worth over $15 million. The profit-sharing program Helen had championed made millionaires out of truck drivers and store managers who'd simply stayed loyal and reinvested their shares. These stories became Walmart legend, and they were real. But underneath the inspirational success story, there was a structural reality that Sam was remarkably candid about. In his own words, "I pay low wages. I can take advantage of that. We're going to be successful, but the basis is a very low-wage, low-benefit model of employment." That wasn't a leaked internal memo or a hostile journalist's characterization. That was Sam Walton describing his own business model out loud. When President Kennedy extended minimum wage protections to retail workers in the 1960s, Sam was furious. He'd been hiring displaced farm workers for 50 cents an hour, and now the government was demanding $1.15. His response was to restructure stores as separate legal entities specifically designed to fall below the revenue threshold that triggered minimum wage requirements. When a federal court ultimately ordered back pay with double-time penalties, Sam reportedly told employees he'd fire anyone who cashed their check. The tension passed without that threat being executed, but the moment revealed something important. When profits were genuinely threatened, the man who talked about employees like family could pivot to ruthlessness with striking speed. By the early 1980s, Walmart was a national force systematically eliminating local competitors across the country. In 1985, Forbes declared Sam the richest man in America. He responded by continuing to drive his pickup truck to the same diner for the same breakfast. The cognitive dissonance was real, and it was entirely intentional. Chapter 4. Building a dynasty that never pays taxes. Sam Walton had survived foreclosures, failed leases, and cutthroat competition. But the threat he feared most in his final decades wasn't a competitor. It was the estate tax. His concern wasn't personal. It was strategic. Sam was terrified that after his death, the government's claim on his estate would force his heirs to sell Walmart shares to cover the bill, potentially destabilizing everything he'd built. So, in the early 1980s, while still in good health, he made a series of moves that would lock his family's fortune in place for generations. He transferred Walmart ownership into a family partnership called Walton Enterprises. Sam and Helen each retained 10%. Each of their 4 children, Rob, John, Jim, and Alice, received 20%. The math was elegant in its ruthlessness. When Sam eventually died, only his 10% faced estate taxation. The other 80% had already transferred to the next generation years earlier, when shares were worth a fraction of their eventual value. This is a strategy available only to the ultra-wealthy, the ability to move assets before they appreciate fully, paying minimal tax on today's value while locking in tomorrow's gains for your heirs. Ordinary American families pay estate taxes on far more modest inheritances, with no comparable mechanism to avoid it. The Waltons didn't invent this playbook, but they executed it at a scale that remains almost unmatched in American financial history. By 1990, Walmart had over 1,700 stores across 42 states and had become the largest retailer in America. But Sam was dying. He'd been diagnosed with leukemia in 1982, fought it back, and by 1990, it had returned as multiple myeloma, incurable. Even as his body failed, he refused to stop. He visited stores, reviewed data, demanded new efficiencies from his hospital bed. In March 1992, weeks before the end, President George H.W. Bush traveled to Bentonville to award Sam the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Sam was in a wheelchair, too weak to stand unassisted, and he still insisted on leading the room in a Walmart cheer right there in front of the President of the United States. That was Sam Walton entire, in one moment. He died on April 5, 1992, 1 week after his 74th birthday. Because of 20 years of careful legal structuring, his heirs kept virtually all of the $23 billion fortune he left behind. The family that built its business model around extracting maximum value from minimum wage workers had also, with perfect legal precision, arranged to extract maximum inheritance from minimum tax exposure. The children now controlled an empire. What they did with it, and to themselves, is where the story gets truly complicated. Chapter 5. The Heirs. Tragedy, Scandal, and Legal Immunity. Sam and Helen raised 4 children in that modest Bentonville ranch house. Each one took the inheritance in a completely different direction. Rob, the eldest, was groomed from early on for leadership. After Sam's death, he became Walmart's board chairman, staying deeply embedded in the business while maintaining a low public profile. The quiet operator behind the largest retail institution on earth. Jim, the most finance-focused of the siblings, became chairman of Arvest Bank and eventually took control of Walton Enterprises itself, managing the family's collective investment portfolio with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to be a Walton inheritance all its own. John was the most surprising of them. He'd served with the Green Berets in Vietnam, earning a Silver Star for pulling wounded soldiers to safety under fire. Genuine, documented heroism that had nothing to do with the family name. After the war, he seemed to struggle with direction, working as a crop duster in the 70s, building boats in the 80s, before eventually gravitating toward the family business and then toward philanthropy, particularly education reform. His heart was always elsewhere from the boardroom. And then there was Alice, the only daughter. The most publicly scrutinized, the most controversial, and ultimately the most culturally significant of Sam's children, for reasons both inspiring and deeply troubling. In 1989, Alice was driving her Porsche on a foggy morning in Fayetteville when a woman named Oleta Hardin stepped into the road. Hardin was 50 years old, a cannery worker whose entire annual salary likely wouldn't have covered Alice's car payment. The impact was fatal. Oleta Hardin died at the scene. Despite reports suggesting Alice had been speeding, she'd received a ticket for speeding the previous year on that same stretch, no charges were filed. The incident was recorded as no fault. Oleta Hardin's family received no public acknowledgement of any kind. A woman who had worked her entire life, who probably shopped at Walmart because she couldn't afford to shop anywhere else, was simply gone. And Alice drove away without consequence. 9 years later, Alice crashed her SUV in Springdale with a blood alcohol level 6 points above the legal limit. Arresting officers reported she asked them, "Do you know who I am? Do you know my last name?" She was convicted of DWI and fined $925. Her net worth at the time was approximately $6.3 billion, so that fine represented roughly 0.00001% of her fortune. The mathematical equivalent of a person of ordinary means being fined a fraction of a single cent. Then in 2011, on her 62nd birthday, she was pulled over again on Interstate 20 near Fort Worth, found by officers to be slumped and unable to complete basic sobriety tests. What followed was a masterclass in how wealth dissolves legal problems before they solidify. Lawyers produced medical documentation claiming the failed test resulted from a 1983 accident rather than impairment. No blood alcohol test had been conducted at the scene. The arresting trooper was mysteriously suspended. Without his testimony, prosecutors allowed the statute of limitations to expire. The case vanished. The records were expunged. Alice Walton walked away from a third incident without consequence. And the lesson written across all three of these episodes is one that makes a lot of Americans deeply uncomfortable. The legal system does not work the same way for a Walton as it works for everyone else. And then there was John. On June 27, 2005, he climbed into his modified ultralight aircraft at Jackson Hole Airport, and shortly after takeoff, the plane went down in Grand Teton National Park. John Walton died instantly at 58 years old, worth $18 billion. The NTSB investigation identified a loose flight control component. He left behind his wife Christy and his son Lucas, and it emerged that he'd quietly directed half his fortune to charitable trusts rather than to his family. Even in death, John Walton was the one who surprised you. Chapter 6. The Walmart Model. Billionaires built on food stamps. By the 2000s, the criticism of Walmart had moved well past general discomfort and into territory that was genuinely hard for the company to explain away. The numbers were stark. Average Walmart sales clerks were earning around $8.23 an hour in 2001, roughly $14,000 a year. Below the poverty line for a family of three. Competitors paid substantially more. But the number that really changed the conversation wasn't the wage figure itself. It was what that wage figure required people to do in order to survive. Walmart workers across the country were qualifying for food stamps, Medicaid, and housing assistance in significant numbers, which meant that American taxpayers were effectively subsidizing Walmart's profitability. The company paid wages that couldn't cover basic survival costs. The government filled the gap. Estimates put the annual taxpayer subsidy of Walmart's low-wage model at over $6 billion. The Walton family, at that point worth well over $100 billion, was running a business model that relied on public assistance programs to make the math work for their employees. The protest grew. Workers staged Black Friday walkouts at stores across the country. Activists marched to Alice Walton's Park Avenue apartment with signs connecting the family's wealth to their workers' poverty. 26 people were arrested outside her building in a single afternoon. The Walton family's response to all of it was largely silence. Measured corporate communications, occasional press releases about wage increases that fell short of what advocates demanded, and a continued private life that remained almost entirely insulated from the pressure. Critics coined the phrase the real welfare queens of America, a deliberately provocative framing designed to attach to the Waltons the same moral judgment that had historically been directed at poor people receiving government assistance. Supporters fired back that Walmart had created millions of jobs and brought genuinely affordable prices to communities that desperately needed them. And that argument wasn't wrong either. Both things were true simultaneously, which is precisely what made the whole conversation so maddening and so unresolvable. Chapter 7. The Arkansas's Fiefdom, a company town on steroids. But step back from the wages debate for a moment and look at the broader picture of Walton influence in Arkansas, because that's where the story moves from large company with problematic labor practices into something that has no real precedent in modern American life. The Northwest Arkansas Regional Airport exists because Alice Walton financed it. The terminal bears her name. Without it, Bentonville would be effectively cut off from the global network of executives and suppliers that Walmart needs to function at its scale. So Alice didn't just donate to a civic project. She built the infrastructure that makes the entire enterprise possible and then put her name on it. Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, genuinely one of the finest art collections in the country, housing over $500 million in masterworks, was built by Alice in 2011, carved into an Ozark hillside in a way that feels almost surreal when you encounter it. Admission is free. That detail matters enormously because it means working-class Arkansas families can walk through a collection that rivals anything in New York City without paying a cent. It is a genuinely extraordinary act of cultural philanthropy, and it is also an act of extraordinary power. Alice Walton deciding unilaterally what world-class culture looks like in this state and where it lives. The University of Arkansas receives Walton millions annually, which shapes what gets funded, what gets built, who gets hired, and what research directions get prioritized. Jim Walton's Arvest Bank is one of the largest financial institutions in Arkansas, holding mortgages on countless homes and loans on countless businesses across the state. The Walton Family Foundation distributes hundreds of millions annually to education and environmental causes, effectively setting policy priorities that elected officials then respond to rather than lead. This is power that operates on a completely different register than normal political influence. No lobbyist, no campaign contribution, no political relationship works this way. What the Waltons have built in Arkansas is something closer to what feudal lords built in medieval Europe, not through malice or conspiracy, but simply through the compounding of economic dominance over decades. Arkansas politicians understand the reality intuitively. Decisions that cross Walton interests risk the economic health of their districts. Decisions that support Walton interests tend to be met with resources and goodwill. Nobody needs to say it out loud. The structure says it for them. The Bentonville that Sam moved to in 1950 had 3,000 people and a town square. It now has 55,000 people, a world-class art museum, an international airport, and the global headquarters of the largest retailer in human history. The transformation is genuinely remarkable. It is also the story of one family remaking an entire place in their own image, and the people who live there having essentially no say in the matter. Chapter 8. The Dynasty That Never Ends. Today, Rob, Jim, and Alice Walton have a combined net worth exceeding over $400 billion. The next generation is already fully in motion. Lucas Walton, John's son, has emerged with a fortune over $11 billion and a strong philanthropic identity of his own. Stuart Walton, Jim's son, sits on Walmart's board, carrying the family name into its fourth generation of corporate leadership. The dynasty shows no structural signs of fading. Walmart generates over $600 billion in annual revenue. The family's controlling stake produces billions in dividends that get reinvested and compounded year after year in a cycle that is essentially self-perpetuating at this scale. The wealth doesn't just grow, It accelerates, because money at this level generates returns that no amount of spending can meaningfully offset. But the contradictions that Sam baked into the foundation of this empire were never resolved, and they never went away. He built Walmart on low prices for ordinary Americans, and simultaneously on low wages that kept many of those same Americans in financial precarity. He spent his public life preaching hard work and personal accountability while legally arranging his affairs to ensure his heirs would inherit extraordinary wealth without ever needing to demonstrate either. He spoke endlessly about treating employees like family while fighting every serious attempt by those employees to organize or collectively bargain. Those aren't small inconsistencies. They're the structural paradox at the center of the whole story. Sam's original house in Bentonville no longer belongs to the Waltons. It was donated after Helen's passing, but it still stands. His old Ford pickup is displayed in a museum. Visitors walk the floors of his original five and dime, now a shrine to the retail revolution he started in a town most people had never heard of. And somewhere tonight, a Walmart employee finishing a closing shift is calculating whether this paycheck covers rent. She probably shops where she works because the discount helps stretch what's left. Her kids are asleep at home because she can't afford a sitter on her hourly wage. She is working for the richest family in American history, in a company that generated over $600 billion in revenue last year, and she is genuinely uncertain whether she can make the math work this month. That tension, between the extraordinary and the ordinary, between the generosity and the exploitation, between the museum on the hill and the shift that ends at midnight, is the real Walton legacy. Sam is buried in Bentonville Cemetery, under a headstone no grander than the ones around it. He wanted it that way. He understood, at the end, that the only thing that outlasts money is the system you build to generate it. And the question of whether that system was worth what it cost everyone else. The house stands, the fortune grows, and the question remains open. And with that note, we wrap up this journey through how the Waltons reached at where they are today. Which part of this story fascinated you the most? Let us know in the comments, and for more such interesting peeks into the lives of rich, take a look at Global Status.